In 1982, the entire population of St. Catherine's Home for Children vanished overnight. 127 children, 18 staff members, gone without explanation. No bodies were found. No ransom demands. No signs of struggle. The official report claimed they were relocated for safety reasons during a gas leak emergency, but no records existed of where they went. For 30 years, the abandoned building sat empty, its windows boarded, its secrets buried behind crumbling brick and silence. Then, in 2012, an urban explorer broke through a false wall in the basement and found something that made him call police immediately. A hidden room filled with medical restraints, falsified psychiatric records, and documents so chilling they shocked even seasoned investigators. What they discovered forced police to reopen a case buried for 30 years and uncover a conspiracy that turned innocent children into ghosts. Deputy Sheriff Sarah Manning was 3 cups of coffee deep into her Tuesday morning when the kid walked through the station doors, backpack slung over one shoulder, dirt under his fingernails, and the kind of nervous energy that screamed trouble. She looked up from the incident report scattered across her desk. 2 domestic disturbances, 1 drunk and disorderly, the usual small-town chaos that kept her busy in a county where nothing much happened anymore. The kid couldn't have been older than 22. Flannel shirt, hiking boots, the pale complexion of someone who spent too much time indoors with a computer. He stood at the front counter, shifting his weight from foot to foot while Sergeant Miller finished a phone call about a missing stop sign. "Help you?" Miller finally asked, hanging up the receiver with more force than necessary. The kid cleared his throat. "Look, I don't want any trouble, but I was exploring this abandoned place last night, and I found something I think you guys should know about." Sarah's pen stopped moving across the page. Urban explorers weren't uncommon around here. The county was littered with abandoned factories, closed schools, empty houses that drew kids with cameras and too much time on their hands. Most of the time, they were harmless. Most of the time. "What kind of something?" Miller asked, his tone already shifting to that particular blend of skepticism and irritation he reserved for walk-ins who wasted his time. The kid reached into his backpack and pulled out a manila folder, thick with papers. "I was at the old St. Catherine's place. You know, the orphanage that's been empty forever?" Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. St. Catherine's. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years. "Place is off limits," Miller said. "Posted signs everywhere. You could get charged with trespassing." I know. That's why I said I don't want trouble." The kid's hands shook slightly as he opened the folder. "But there's this hidden room in the basement, behind a fake wall, and there's stuff in there that's... I think something really bad happened there." He spread photographs across the counter, Polaroids taken with flash, showing a cramped concrete room, metal bed frames with leather restraints still attached, filing cabinets, stacks of yellowed documents. Sarah stood up so fast her chair rolled backward into the wall. She moved to the counter, her boots clicking against the linoleum, and stared down at the images. The room looked like something from a nightmare, or a psychiatric ward from 50 years ago. "Where exactly did you find this?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The kid, he'd introduced himself as Tyler something, she thought, pointed to one of the photos. "Basement level, east wing. There's this wall that looks normal, but when I was taking pictures I noticed the mortar was different, newer, so I pried at it with my crowbar and found this space behind it." He pulled out another photo. This one showed the wall itself, or what was left of it. Chunks of concrete and brick scattered across the floor, revealing a dark opening beyond. "How big is the room?" Sarah asked. "Maybe 12 by 15 feet. Not huge, but it's packed with stuff." Tyler flipped through more photos. Medical files, treatment logs, and some of the names on these documents. He trailed off, swallowing hard. Miller leaned over Sarah's shoulder. Names of what? Kids, really young kids, and the stuff they were supposedly being treated for? Tyler's face had gone pale. "Normal kids don't get treatment like this. Not unless something's really wrong with the system? Sarah studied the photos more carefully. In one image, she could make out part of a document header. Patient Transfer Authorization. Saint. Catherine's Psychiatric Evaluation Unit. Her blood went cold. Psychiatric Evaluation Unit? St. Catherine's had been an orphanage, a regular children's home. She'd grown up hearing stories about it from older residents who remembered when it was still operating. "Did you take any of the actual documents?" she asked. Tyler nodded, reaching back into the folder. "Just a few. I didn't want to disturb too much, but these seemed important." He handed her 3 pages, photocopied on what looked like an ancient machine. The paper was brittle, the text faded, but readable. The first was a medical evaluation form dated March 15, 1981. Patient name, Sarah Michelle Garrett, age 7. Diagnosis, severe developmental delays, aggressive behavioral patterns, recommended for immediate psychiatric intervention. But handwritten in the margin, in different ink, someone had scrawled, "Normal development, healthy child, transfer for bed space." Sarah read it twice, her mouth going dry. The second document was a transfer order. 23 children, ages 5 to 12, moved from general population to specialized care facility in February 1982, just months before the reported gas leak evacuation. The third made her hands shake. It was a list, names, ages, and notations. 47 children total, each marked with either transferred or processed. Next to the processed entries, someone had written dates and what looked like disposal codes. At the bottom of the page, in the same handwriting that had noted Sarah Garrett's true condition. God forgive us. These babies never deserved this. Miller was reading over her shoulder, his breathing audibly shallow. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. Sarah looked up at Tyler, who was watching them with the expression of someone who'd stumbled into a horror movie and couldn't find the exit. "You said there were more documents in that room?" He nodded. "Boxes of them, file cabinets full, and—" He hesitated, then pulled out one final photo. This one showed a corner of the hidden room where someone had carved words into the concrete wall. The flash had caught them clearly. "They told us we were sick. We weren't sick. Help us." Below that, in smaller letters, dozens of names scratched into the stone. Children's names, first names only, but carved deep, like whoever did it had all the time in the world and nothing left to lose. Sarah stared at the photo until the names blurred together. Her chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped bands around her ribs and was slowly tightening them. "I'm going out there," she said, the words coming out before she'd fully decided to say them. Miller frowned. "Sarah, we should call this in to the state police. This is way above our—" "No!" Her voice came out sharper than she'd intended. "This happened in our county. These were our kids." She looked at Tyler. "You're going to show me exactly where you found this room. Right now." Tyler nodded quickly. "Yeah, okay. I can do that." Miller stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Manning, what's got into you? I've never seen you react like this to a case." Sarah was already reaching for her jacket, her service weapon, her keys. The photos of that carved wall kept flashing in her mind. All those names, all those children. "Just something about it," she said, and meant it. Something about those carved names, those children's desperate words scratched into concrete, made her chest tight with an anger she couldn't quite name. "Let's go," she told Tyler, heading for the door. Behind her, Miller called out something about protocol and jurisdictional authority, but Sarah was already pushing through the station's front doors into the gray October morning. She had a room full of secrets to examine, and for reasons she couldn't explain, this felt personal in a way that scared her. The drive to St. Catherine's took 20 minutes through winding county roads that Sarah had traveled countless times but never really noticed. Today, every mile marker felt like a countdown to something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Tyler sat in the passenger seat of her patrol car, nervously picking at the corner of his photo folder. He'd been quiet since they left the station, occasionally giving directions, but otherwise lost in whatever thoughts had driven him to break into an abandoned building in the first place. "You do this often?" Sarah asked as they passed the rusted skeleton of an old gas station. "Urban exploring?" Tyler shrugged. "Sometimes. It's like, I don't know, these places have stories, you know? And once they're torn down, those stories disappear forever." Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure she agreed. Some stories were probably better left buried. The orphanage appeared through the tree line like something from a Gothic novel. 3 stories of red brick and broken windows, ivy crawling up the walls like fingers trying to pull the building back into the earth. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, sagging in places where kids had cut through it over the years. Sarah parked at the gate and got out, her breath visible in the October air. The place felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with its abandonment. Even from the parking area, she could sense the weight of whatever had happened here. "Gate's been cut," Tyler said, pointing to a section where the chain link had been peeled back. "That's how I got in last night." They squeezed through the opening and walked up the cracked driveway. Dead leaves crunched under their feet, the only sound besides the distant hum of traffic on the county road. Up close, the building was even more imposing. The main entrance was boarded over with plywood that had weathered to a dull gray, but Tyler led her around to a side door where someone had pried off the boards. "This is how you got in?" Sarah asked. "Yeah, door was already unlocked. I think other people have been here before me." The interior hit Sarah like a physical blow. The smell of mold and decay was overwhelming, but underneath it was something else. The lingering scent of institutional disinfectant and boiled vegetables and something indefinably sad. Tyler clicked on a powerful LED flashlight, illuminating a hallway lined with peeling paint and water-stained walls. Children's artwork still clung to a bulletin board near what had once been the main office. The colors faded, but the innocent crayon drawings somehow making the abandonment more heartbreaking. "Kitchen's that way," Tyler said, pointing down a side corridor. "Dining hall's through there, but the basement entrance is this way." They walked deeper into the building, their footsteps echoing in the empty spaces. Sarah's flashlight beam caught glimpses of the orphanage's former life. A wheelchair abandoned in a corner, a pile of moldering books, a child's sneaker with no mate. The basement door stood open, revealing wooden stairs that descended into complete darkness. "It's not too bad," Tyler said, sensing her hesitation. "The stairs are solid. It's just the smell that gets to you." He was right about the smell. As they descended, the mustiness intensified, joined by the sharp scent of rust and something organic that Sarah didn't want to identify. The basement was a maze of storage rooms and utility spaces, all connected by narrow corridors with exposed pipes running overhead. Tyler navigated confidently, leading her past rooms filled with broken furniture and cardboard boxes that had long since collapsed under their own weight. "Here," he said, stopping in front of what looked like a solid concrete wall. "This is where I found it." Sarah ran her flashlight beam across the surface. Tyler was right. The mortar was different here, newer and slightly off-color from the surrounding wall. "How did you even notice this?" she asked. "I was photographing the basement layout when I noticed the room dimensions didn't match up. This hallway should have been longer based on the building's footprint, so I started looking closer and saw the mortar difference." The hole Tyler had made was roughly 3 feet square, just large enough for a person to crawl through. Sarah knelt beside it and shined her light into the hidden space beyond. What she saw made her breath catch. The room was exactly as Tyler had described, small, windowless, filled with the remnants of something that should never have existed in a children's home. Metal bed frames with leather restraints, filing cabinets, and along one wall, shelving units filled with glass bottles and medical equipment that looked like it belonged in a laboratory, not an orphanage. "Jesus," Sarah whispered. "I know, and that's not even the worst part." Tyler squeezed through the opening first, then helped Sarah through. Inside, The smell was even stronger. Rust and chemicals and something underneath that made her stomach turn. Tyler directed her flashlight beam toward the far corner, where the carved message was clearly visible in the concrete. They told us we were sick. We weren't sick. Help us? Below it, scratched in smaller letters, were the names. Sarah counted at least 30 before she had to look away. "The filing cabinets are over here," Tyler said, leading her to a row of dented metal drawers. Most of them are locked, but this one was open. He pulled out a thick manila folder and handed it to Sarah. Inside were medical records, dozens of them, all for children between the ages of 5 and 15. Sarah flipped through them, her horror growing with each page. The pattern was consistent. Children admitted to St. Catherine's as orphans, then systematically reclassified as mentally ill or developmentally disabled. Normal childhood behaviors, crying at bedtime, asking for their parents, acting out during lessons, were documented as symptoms of serious psychiatric conditions. "Look at this one," Tyler said, pointing to a file marked Angela Rose Whitman, age 6. The intake form described Angela as healthy, well-adjusted, above-average intelligence. But 3 weeks later, a psychiatric evaluation claimed she suffered from severe behavioral disorders requiring immediate intervention and isolation. Handwritten notes in the margins told a different story. Child continues to ask for her mother, resistant to sedation. Consider transfer to Ward C. "Ward C?" Sarah asked. Tyler shrugged. "No idea, but look at this." He handed her another file, this one for a boy named David Patrick Coleman, age 8. Same pattern, healthy child reclassified as mentally ill. But David's file contained something extra, a photograph. It showed a small, windowless room with concrete walls, a child's bed with restraints, and scrawled on the wall behind the bed in what looked like fingernail scratches. "Mama, help me." Sarah's hands were shaking as she closed the file. "How many files are there?" "I didn't count them all, but dozens, maybe more, and Sarah—" Tyler's voice trailed off. "What?" "Some of these kids, according to their files, they were transferred to other facilities, but there's no record of where. And some of them—" He pulled out another folder, this one thicker than the rest. "Some of them are marked as deceased, but the death certificates don't match up with the medical records." Sarah opened the folder Tyler handed her. Inside were death certificates for 7 children, all signed by the same doctor, Dr. Marcus Thornfield. But the causes of death were vague: respiratory failure, cardiac complications, systemic infection. What chilled Sarah to the bone were the handwritten notes attached to each certificate. Disposal completed. No family notification required. "These children," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They weren't sick. They were murdered." Tyler nodded grimly. "And then they covered it up, made it look like natural deaths, or transferred them to places that don't exist." Sarah's radio crackled to life, making them both jump. Miller's voice echoed in the small space. "Manning, you copy? County supervisor's been asking about your location." Sarah keyed the mic. "I'm following up on that report from this morning. I'll be back at the station within the hour." "Copy that. Everything okay out there?" Sarah looked around the hidden room, at the restraints, the files, the desperate message carved into the wall, and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. "Everything's fine," she lied, "just documenting some evidence." She clicked off the radio and turned back to Tyler. "I need you to show me everything, every file, every document, every piece of evidence in this room, and then we're going to figure out who was responsible for this." Tyler nodded. "There's more, a lot more. But Sarah?" He looked at her with an expression that was part fear, part determination. "Some of these files, they mention a maternity ward, babies being born here, then transferred or processed. Are you sure you want to see all of it?" Sarah's chest tightened. A maternity ward at an orphanage, babies being processed like paperwork. "Show me everything," she said. because somewhere in this room full of horrors, she had a feeling she was going to find answers to questions she'd never known she needed to ask. And maybe, finally, the truth about what had really happened at St. Catherine's in those final days before everyone disappeared. The maternity files were kept in a separate section of the filing cabinets, organized by year and marked with a red stripe that someone had painted across the drawer fronts. Tyler had to force the lock with a screwdriver he'd brought in his backpack, the metal screeching in protest before finally giving way. "These drawers were locked separately," he said, pulling out the first folder. "Like someone wanted to make extra sure nobody found them." Sarah's flashlight illuminated the contents as Tyler spread them across one of the metal bed frames. Unlike the other medical records, these files were meticulously organized, with photographs attached to each document and detailed notes written in the same precise handwriting. The first file made Sarah's stomach drop. Live birth record, February 15th, 1982. Patient M, 47. The photograph showed a woman in her early 20s lying on a hospital bed, exhausted but smiling as she held a newborn baby. In the corner of the photo, someone had written, "Healthy male, 6 pounds 4 ounces, normal development." But the medical notes told a different story. Infant shows signs of severe developmental delays, recommended for immediate psychiatric evaluation and transfer to specialized care facility. Attached to the file was a death certificate dated February 18, 1982, 3 days after birth. Cause of death: congenital heart defect, respiratory failure. "They're saying the baby died," Sarah said, running her finger along the typed text. "But look at this." She pointed to a handwritten note stapled to the back of the death certificate. "Transfer completed. Subject relocated to Facility 7. Mother informed of death as planned." Tyler leaned closer. "Facility 7? What the hell is Facility 7? Sarah flipped through more files, finding the same pattern repeated again and again. Women giving birth at St. Catherine's, healthy babies being declared sick or dead, then secretly transferred to unknown locations. In every case, the mothers were told their children had died. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, opening another file. "They weren't just taking the orphans, they were stealing newborns." The photographs were the worst part. Page after page of women holding babies they would never see again, their faces full of love and hope, completely unaware that their children were already marked for processing. "Here," Tyler said, pulling out a larger folder marked Maternity Operations Summary Dash, 1981 to 1982. "This one's different." Inside was a typewritten report, professional and clinical in its language, that outlined what could only be described as a systematic operation to harvest infants from unwed mothers. Sarah read aloud. "Subject pool consists primarily of unmarried females aged 16 to 25 with no family support systems. Subjects are housed in the maternity wing during pregnancy and provided with basic medical care. Upon delivery, healthy infants are evaluated for placement in approved facilities, while mothers are informed of complications resulting in infant mortality." "Approved facilities," Tyler repeated. They had a whole network of places to send these kids. Sarah continued reading. "Cooperation from medical staff has been exemplary. Dr. Thornfield continues to provide necessary documentation while Nurse Morrison handles maternal counseling and grief support. Administrative oversight provided by Director Walsh ensures complete operational security." "Walsh," Sarah said, the name triggering something in her memory. "Why does that sound familiar?" She flipped to the next page and found her answer. At the bottom was a signature. "Margaret Walsh, Director of Operations, St. Catherine's Home for Children." "Margaret Walsh," Sarah repeated. "I know that name. She still lives here, in town. She runs the food bank at the Methodist Church." Tyler stared at her. "The woman who was stealing babies is still alive? And she's running a food bank?" Sarah's mind was racing. "Margaret Walsh. a kind-faced woman in her 70s who organized charity drives and volunteered at community events. Sarah had probably spoken to her a dozen times over the years, never knowing she was talking to someone who had orchestrated the theft of infants. "We need to keep looking," Sarah said, forcing herself to focus on the files. "If Walsh is still alive, then there might be others. People who know what happened to these children." They worked through the files methodically, documenting each case, taking photographs of the most damning evidence. The scope of the operation became clearer with each folder. Over a period of 15 months, 43 babies had been born at St. Catherine's maternity ward. According to the official records, 37 of them had died from various complications. But the handwritten notes revealed the truth. 37 healthy infants had been declared dead and secretly transferred to facilities throughout the region. "Look at this," Tyler said, holding up a file that was thicker than the others. "This one's got correspondence." The file contained letters between St. Catherine's and various institutions, psychiatric hospitals, research facilities, and what appeared to be private adoption agencies that specialized in difficult placements. One letter, dated January 1982, was particularly chilling. "We can accommodate up to 15 additional subjects this quarter. Payment of $5,000 per healthy infant remains acceptable, with bonus compensation for subjects under 6 months of age. As always, complete documentation erasure is guaranteed." "They were selling them," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "They were selling babies to psychiatric institutions for experiments." Tyler's face had gone pale, and the mothers never knew. They thought their babies were dead. Sarah felt something break loose in her chest, a cold, sharp anger that she'd never experienced before. These weren't just statistics or case files. These were real children, real mothers, real families destroyed by greed and institutional power. Her radio crackled again. This time it was a different voice. "Dispatch. Any unit in the area of St. Catherine's Road, we've got a call about suspicious activity at the old orphanage. Caller reports seeing flashlights in the building." Sarah and Tyler looked at each other. "Someone's watching us," Tyler whispered. Sarah keyed her radio. "This is Manning. I'm at St. Catherine's following up on an investigation. No assistance needed." "Copy that, Manning." Caller specifically mentioned 2 individuals with flashlights in the basement area. "You want us to send backup?" "Negative. I've got it handled." But as she clicked off the radio, Sarah felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Someone had been watching them. Someone who knew exactly where they were and what they were doing. "We need to get out of here," Tyler said, already gathering up the files. "No," Sarah's voice was firm. "We need to finish documenting this, but carefully." She moved to the wall where the children's names were carved, taking photographs of each one. As her flashlight beam moved across the concrete, she noticed something she'd missed before. Newer scratches, smaller and more deliberate. Numbers. Someone had carved a series of numbers below the names. F747, F748, F749. "Tyler, look at this," she called out. He joined her at the wall, studying the numbers. "Those look like file codes. F7, Facility 7? "Maybe, but look at the carving style. These are different from the names. Newer, like someone came back and added them later." Sarah ran her finger along the carved numbers, feeling the rough edges where someone had worked patiently to leave this message. At the bottom of the list, in letters barely visible, were 2 words. "Find us." "Someone survived," she whispered. "Someone who was taken from here came back and left this message." Tyler was photographing the numbers when they heard it, the distant sound of a door closing somewhere in the building above them. They both froze. Sarah drew her service weapon and motioned for Tyler to stay behind her. They listened in the darkness, ears straining for any sound of movement. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the main floor directly above them. "This is Deputy Sheriff Manning," Sarah called out, her voice echoing through the building. "Identify yourself." The footsteps stopped. Then they heard something that made Sarah's blood run cold, the sound of the basement door slamming shut, followed by the unmistakable click of a lock being turned. "Shit," Tyler whispered. "We're trapped." Sarah tried her radio, but the signal was weak in the basement. Static filled the airwaves, punctuated by fragments of distant conversations that had nothing to do with their situation. "There has to be another way out," she said, more to convince herself than Tyler. But as they searched the basement with renewed urgency, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had locked them in knew exactly what they'd found in the hidden room. And more importantly, knew exactly why it needed to stay buried. The footsteps above them resumed, moving with purpose now, deliberate sounds of someone searching the building methodically. Sarah and Tyler crouched in the hidden room, listening as the intruder moved from room to room on the main floor. "They know we're down here," Tyler whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah nodded, her grip tight on her service weapon. Whoever was up there wasn't trying to hide their presence anymore. The message was clear. "You're trapped, and I want you to know it." She tried her radio again, adjusting the frequency. This time she got through to dispatch, though the signal crackled with static. "Dispatch, this is Manning at St. Catherine's. I need immediate backup. We have an intruder on the premises, and the basement exit has been compromised." "Copy that, Manning. Units are en route. ETA 8 minutes. 8 minutes. Sarah looked around the small room, calculating their options. The hole in the wall was their only way in or out of the hidden space. If someone came down here, they'd be sitting ducks. The footsteps above stopped directly over their location. Then they heard a new sound, metal scraping against concrete. Someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. "What are they doing?" Tyler asked. Sarah's stomach dropped as she realized what she was hearing. "They're barricading the basement entrance, piling furniture against the door." The scraping sounds continued for several minutes, accompanied by heavy thuds as objects were stacked against what was probably their only way out. Whoever was up there was methodical, taking their time to ensure Sarah and Tyler wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. When the sounds finally stopped, the silence was somehow worse than the footsteps had been. Sarah's radio crackled. "Manning, this is Sergeant Miller." "We're on scene, but the building appears to be empty. No vehicles in the parking area. You copy?" Sarah keyed the mic. "Miller, we're trapped in the basement. Someone barricaded the door from the inside. They may still be in the building." "Copy. We're coming in." But as the minutes ticked by, Sarah began to worry. The basement was a maze of rooms and corridors. Even if backup got through the barricaded door, finding the hidden room would be nearly impossible without Tyler's guidance. "We need to assume we're on our own," she told Tyler. "Is there any other way out of this basement?" Tyler shook his head. "I only explored part of it last night, but this building is old. There might be utility tunnels or service entrances I didn't see." They squeezed back through the hole in the wall and began searching the basement systematically. Sarah's flashlight revealed a warren of storage rooms, each filled with the detritus of the orphanage's operation. Broken furniture, moldering books, boxes of documents too damaged to read. In what appeared to be an old laundry room, Tyler found something promising, a heavy metal grate set into the floor. "Storm drain, maybe," he suggested, pulling at the rusted metal. Sarah helped him lift the grate, revealing a concrete tunnel barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. The air wafting up from below smelled of stagnant water and decay, but it was moving air, which meant the tunnel led somewhere. "I'll go first," Sarah said, holstering her weapon and pulling out her flashlight. The tunnel was a nightmare of spiderwebs and standing water, but it ran roughly parallel to the building's foundation. Sarah crawled forward on her hands and knees, Tyler close behind her, both of them trying not to think about what might be living in the stagnant pools they were crawling through. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 minutes, Sarah saw light ahead. Not electric light, but the gray glow of an overcast day filtering through another grate. This exit brought them up behind the building, near what had once been a playground. Sarah helped Tyler out of the tunnel, and they both stood there for a moment, breathing fresh air and trying to wipe the worst of the muck from their clothes. "Manning!" Sergeant Miller's voice carried across the grounds. "Where the hell are you?" Sarah waved her arms until she spotted Miller and two other deputies near the main entrance. They jogged over, and Sarah quickly explained what they'd found in the hidden room. Miller's expression grew darker with each detail. "You're telling me there's evidence of systematic child abuse hidden in that basement? And someone tried to trap you down there?" "More than abuse," Sarah said. "Murder and theft of newborns. This goes back 30 years, Miller. We're talking about a conspiracy that involved the orphanage administration, medical staff, and God knows who else." "The person who trapped us," Tyler added, "they knew exactly what we were looking for. This wasn't random." Miller nodded grimly. "We found the barricade. Took us 20 minutes to clear it. Whoever did it used heavy furniture, desks, filing cabinets, stuff that would take multiple people to move." "Multiple people?" Sarah felt her chest tighten. "So we're not dealing with one person trying to cover this up. There's still a network." "That's what it looks like." "And Sarah?" Miller's expression was troubled. "We need to talk about jurisdiction here. Evidence of crimes this old, this extensive. The state police are going to want to take over." Sarah shook her head. "Not yet. Give me 24 hours to document everything properly. Once the state police get involved, this becomes a media circus. If there are people still alive who were involved in this, they'll disappear the moment this hits the news." Miller considered this. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we pay a visit to Margaret Walsh. She signed off on those maternity operations. If anyone knows where those children were sent, it's her." "You want to interview a 70-something woman based on documents you found in an abandoned building without backup from the state police?" "I want to ask her some questions before she has time to lawyer up or disappear," Sarah said firmly. "Walsh is the thread that unravels this whole thing, but only if we get to her before word spreads that we found the hidden room." Tyler looked between them. "What about the files?" "All that evidence?" "We secure the scene and document everything," Miller said. "But quietly. No media, no official statements until we know what we're dealing with." Sarah nodded. "And we find out who was in that building today. Someone with access. Someone who knew we were getting close to the truth." As they walked back toward the patrol cars, Sarah found herself thinking about the numbers carved into the wall. "Find us," someone had written. Facility 7 was still out there somewhere, and if the person who carved those numbers was right, some of the children might still be alive. But first, they needed to have a conversation with Margaret Walsh, and Sarah had a feeling that conversation was going to change everything. Margaret Walsh's house sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees, their October leaves scattered across a lawn that looked like it belonged in a magazine. The white clapboard siding was freshly painted, the flower beds meticulously maintained, and a wooden sign by the front door read, "Bless this home," in cheerful script. Sarah sat in her patrol car for a moment, studying the house through her windshield. It was hard to reconcile this picture of suburban normalcy with the woman who had systematically stolen babies and falsified death certificates 30 years ago. "You sure you want to do this alone?" Miller had asked back at the station. "Walsh might lawyer up the second she sees a badge." But Sarah had insisted on coming by herself. A single deputy asking friendly questions was less threatening than a formal interview at the station. She needed Walsh to feel comfortable, to let her guard down. Sarah walked up the brick pathway and rang the doorbell. Chimes echoed inside the house, followed by the sound of footsteps and a dog barking. The woman who opened the door was exactly as Sarah remembered. Silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a cardigan that probably came from the church donation box. Margaret Walsh looked like everyone's favorite grandmother. "Deputy Manning," Walsh said with a warm smile. "What a pleasant surprise. Is everything all right?" "Just following up on some old paperwork, Mrs. Walsh. I was hoping you might have a few minutes to chat." "Of course, dear. Come in, come in. I was just making tea." The interior of the house was as perfectly maintained as the exterior. Doilies on the end tables, family photographs covering every surface, the lingering scent of vanilla candles, and fresh baking. A small dog, some kind of terrier mix, yapped once at Sarah, then settled at Walsh's feet. "Please sit," Walsh said, gesturing to a floral print sofa. "I'll just get the tea." As Walsh bustled around the kitchen, Sarah studied the photographs on the mantelpiece. Most showed Walsh at various church functions and community events, but one caught her attention, a formal portrait from what looked like the 1980s, showing Walsh in a white dress standing next to a man in a dark suit. "That's my late husband, Robert," Walsh said, returning with a tea tray. "He passed 5 years ago. We were married for 43 years. "I'm sorry for your loss," Sarah said automatically, accepting a delicate china cup. "Mrs. Walsh, I wanted to ask you about your time at St. Catherine's Home for Children." Walsh's hand paused for just a moment as she poured her own tea, but her expression remained pleasant. "Oh my, that takes me back. I worked there for nearly 15 years. Such a rewarding experience, helping those poor children." "You were the director of operations, is that right?" "Administrative coordinator," Walsh corrected gently. "I handled the day-to-day management, scheduling, supplies, that sort of thing. Dr. Thornfield was the medical director, and Father Mackenzie oversaw the overall operation." Sarah pulled out a small notebook, trying to look casual. "Do you remember the final months before the building closed? There was some kind of emergency evacuation, wasn't there?" Walsh's smile faltered slightly. "Yes, a gas leak. Terrible situation. We had to relocate everyone very quickly." "Where did the children go?" "Various facilities throughout the state, foster homes, other orphanages. It was quite chaotic, as you can imagine." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "I'm sure it was difficult, especially for the younger children. The infants must have been particularly vulnerable." "Infants?" Walsh's voice was carefully neutral. "The maternity ward. There must have been newborns at the time of the evacuation." Walsh set down her teacup with a gentle clink. "Oh, we hadn't operated a maternity ward for several years by 1982. Budget constraints, you understand. Expectant mothers were referred to the county hospital." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Walsh was lying, and they both knew it. But her expression remained kindly, grandmother sweet. "That's interesting," Sarah said, "because I've been looking through some old medical records, and they seem to indicate there was an active maternity program right up until the closure." "Medical records?" Walsh's eyes sharpened just slightly. "Where did you find old medical records, dear?" "The building isn't as empty as everyone thought," Sarah said carefully. "We discovered some files that had been overlooked." Walsh was quiet for a long moment, her fingers wrapped around her teacup. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its warmth. "Those records should have been destroyed years ago. Patient confidentiality, you understand?" "Yes, confidentiality is important," Sarah agreed, "especially when it comes to protecting vulnerable people, like mothers who were told their babies died when they actually didn't." The change in Walsh's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. Her shoulders straightened, her smile became fixed, and something cold flickered behind her glasses. "I'm not sure what you think you've found, Deputy, but I can assure you that every death at St. Catherine's was properly documented and reported to the appropriate authorities." "I'm sure it was documented," Sarah said, "very thoroughly documented. The question is whether the documentation was accurate." Walsh stood up abruptly. "I think perhaps you should speak with my attorney before we continue this conversation." "Of course, that's your right," Sarah said, remaining seated. "But Mrs. Walsh, before I go, do you know what happened to Facility 7? The color drained from Walsh's face. She stood frozen for a moment, her hand gripping the back of her chair. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice was barely a whisper. "Facility 7, where the healthy babies were sent. Where they're probably still being held, 30 years later." Walsh's composure cracked completely. She sat back down heavily, her hands shaking as she reached for her teacup. "You don't understand," she said. "You don't understand what it was like back then. Unwed mothers, babies no one wanted. We were helping them, giving those children opportunities they never would have had. By stealing them? By telling their mothers they were dead? By placing them in homes that could provide proper care," Walsh snapped, her grandmother mask finally slipping. "Do you have any idea what happens to children born to teenage mothers with no support systems? They end up back in institutions anyway. We were simply streamlining the process." Sarah felt sick. "Streamlining the process. That's what you call stealing babies." "We saved those children," Walsh said fiercely. "Every single one of them. They were given to families who could provide for them, educate them, love them properly." "Families? Or research facilities?" "Because the files I found suggest those babies were sold to psychiatric institutions for experimental programs." Walsh's face went white again. That's not... Some children required specialized care, yes, but... Where is Facility 7, Mrs. Walsh?" "I can't tell you that." "Can't or won't?" Walsh stood up again, her hands clenched at her sides. "This conversation is over, Deputy Manning." "I want you to leave my house immediately." Sarah rose slowly, tucking her notebook away. "I'll be back, Mrs. Walsh, with a warrant and a lot more questions. And when I find Facility 7, I'm going to find out what happened to every single child you stole." "You're making a terrible mistake," Walsh said, following Sarah to the door. "Some things are better left buried." "Not these things," Sarah said. "Not when there are people still out there who were taken from their mothers as babies." As Sarah walked back to her patrol car, she heard Walsh's front door slam behind her. Through the living room window, she could see Walsh on the phone, speaking rapidly to someone. Sarah sat in her car and called Miller. "She knows about Facility 7, she said when he answered, "and she's scared. We need to move fast. She's making calls right now." "What's your next move?" Sarah looked back at the house, where Walsh was still visible through the window, gesticulating as she spoke. "I'm going to find Dr. Thornfield. He signed all those death certificates. If Walsh won't talk, maybe he will." "Sarah, be careful. If Walsh is making calls, that means there are still people out there who know about this conspiracy. People who might not want it exposed." "I know," Sarah said, starting her engine. "But Miller..." "We're close. I can feel it. And somewhere out there, people who were stolen as babies are still waiting to be found." As she drove away from Walsh's house, Sarah's mind was racing. Walsh had confirmed that Facility 7 existed, had confirmed that babies were taken and given to families, though Sarah suspected those families weren't the loving homes Walsh claimed they were. But most importantly, Walsh's reaction suggested that some of those stolen children might still be alive, still waiting to be rescued, still waiting to learn the truth about who they really were. Dr. Marcus Thornfield lived in a gated retirement community 20 minutes outside town, the kind of place where the lawns were always green and the residents drove golf carts instead of cars. Sarah had to show her badge to the security guard before he'd let her through the main gate. Finding Thornfield's address had been easy. Miller had run a quick search and discovered the doctor was still alive at 83, living in assisted care, but apparently still mentally sharp. What had been harder was deciding how to approach him. Unlike Walsh, Thornfield would know exactly why a deputy sheriff was coming to ask about St. Catherine's. The retirement complex was a collection of small, identical houses arranged around a central clubhouse and pool area. Thornfield's unit was near the back, with a small garden that looked professionally maintained and a carport that housed an ancient Buick. Sarah rang the doorbell and waited. After a moment, she heard shuffling footsteps and the sound of multiple locks being undone. The man who opened the door was tall and thin, with wispy white hair and intelligent blue eyes behind thick glasses. He wore a cardigan sweater despite the mild weather, and his hands had the slight tremor that sometimes came with age. "Dr. Thornfield?" Sarah showed her badge. "I'm Deputy Sheriff Manning. I was hoping to speak with you about your time at St. Catherine's Home for Children." Thornfield's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw something flicker in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or resignation. "I've been wondering when someone would finally come," he said quietly. "Please come in." The interior of the house was sparse but clean, furnished with the kind of practical furniture that came with assisted living. Medical textbooks lined the shelves, and framed diplomas covered one wall. But what caught Sarah's attention were the photographs on the side table, dozens of pictures showing children of various ages, all smiling at the camera. "Those are my real patients," Thornfield said, noticing her attention. "Children I actually helped during my 40 years of practice. I keep them here to remind myself that I wasn't always—" He paused. "That I wasn't always what I became at St. Catherine's." Sarah sat down in the chair he offered, surprised by his directness. "Dr. Thornfield, I need to ask you about the medical records from St. Catherine's, specifically the death certificates you signed." Thornfield nodded slowly. "How many children?" "Excuse me?" "How many death certificates did you find?" "I signed so many over those final months, I lost count." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of deception, but Thornfield seemed almost relieved to be having this conversation. 37 babies, she said. All allegedly died within days of birth from various complications." 37, Thornfield repeated. "Yes, that sounds right. All healthy babies, all stolen from their mothers." The frank admission hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You're confessing to falsifying death certificates?" "I'm confessing to being a coward," Thornfield said bitterly. "I'm confessing to looking the other way while children were stolen and sold. I'm confessing to 30 years of nightmares about babies I declared dead who were very much alive." He stood up slowly and walked to the window, looking out at the manicured grounds of the retirement community. "You have to understand, Deputy Manning, it didn't start that way. When I first took the position at St. Catherine's, it was legitimate medical work, caring for orphaned children, helping expectant mothers who had nowhere else to go. But gradually, things changed." "What kind of changes?" Thornfield turned back to face her. "The funding structure changed. The state paid more for children with special needs, psychiatric conditions, developmental disorders. At first, it was just a matter of creative diagnosis, labeling difficult children as emotionally disturbed to secure additional resources. But it escalated. Margaret Walsh brought in new connections, people who were willing to pay significant money for specific types of children, research facilities that needed subjects, private institutions that specialized in experimental treatments. Sarah felt her stomach turn. "You're talking about selling children to be used as test subjects." "I tried to tell myself we were helping them," Thornfield said, his voice barely audible. "That these facilities would provide care that the children couldn't get elsewhere. But I knew. Deep down, I knew what was really happening." "Why didn't you stop it?" Thornfield laughed bitterly. "Do you know what happens to a doctor who reports institutional abuse? Especially when that institution has connections to state agencies and church organizations? My medical license would have been revoked. My career would have been over. And the children? They would have disappeared anyway, because there were other doctors willing to sign the papers." Sarah leaned forward. "Dr. Thornfield, where is Facility 7? The old man's face went pale. "How do you know about Facility 7? "I found references to it in the files, children being transferred there." "Where is it?" Thornfield was quiet for a long moment, his hands shaking more noticeably now. "It's not a place," he said finally. "It's a program, a research initiative run by a consortium of psychiatric institutions and private medical companies. Children sent to Facility 7 were distributed among various locations depending on their usefulness." "Usefulness for what?" "Psychological research, drug trials, behavioral modification experiments." Thornfield's voice was getting smaller with each word. They wanted children who had no families, no one who would ask questions. Orphans and babies whose mothers believed they were dead were perfect subjects. Sarah felt like she might vomit. Are you telling me that healthy babies were stolen from their mothers and used in medical experiments? Some were. Others were placed in controlled environments designed to study the effects of isolation, institutionalization, sensory deprivation. Thornfield sat down heavily. The research was funded by government agencies interested in psychological warfare and behavior control. Jesus Christ! Sarah stood up, pacing to the window. How many facilities were involved? I don't know the exact number, but it was extensive. Multiple states, dozens of institutions. Children were moved frequently to prevent them from forming attachments or memories. Are any of them still alive? Thornfield nodded. Some of them, yes. They would be adults now in their 30s. But Deputy Manning, you have to understand, these people have been institutionalized their entire lives. They don't know who they really are. They don't know they were stolen. Sarah turned back to face him. Do you have records, names, locations? I kept copies of everything, Thornfield said quietly. Insurance, you might say, evidence to protect myself if the operation was ever exposed. He walked to a bookshelf and pulled out what looked like a medical textbook. But when he opened it, Sarah saw that the pages had been cut out to create a hiding space. Inside was a thick manila envelope. Transfer records, facility locations, contact information for the administrators who ran the program, Thornfield said, handing her the envelope. Everything I could document without raising suspicions. Sarah opened the envelope carefully. Inside were photocopied documents, handwritten notes, and what appeared to be a detailed organizational chart showing the connections between St. Catherine's and various research facilities. Dr. Thornfield, she said, studying the papers, some of these facilities are still operating. Some of these people are still in positions of authority. I know. That's why I've been waiting 30 years for someone to come asking questions. That's why I've kept these records hidden. Sarah looked up at him. You've been waiting for someone to expose this? I've been waiting for someone brave enough to take on the people who ran this program, Thornfield said, because Deputy Manning, Margaret Walsh, was just middle management. The real architects of this operation have connections that reach much higher than a small-town orphanage. Sarah's radio crackled to life. Miller's voice came through, tense and urgent. Manning, we have a problem. Margaret Walsh is dead. Apparent suicide, but something doesn't feel right. How soon can you get back here? Sarah keyed the mic. On my way. She looked at Thornfield, who didn't seem surprised by the news. They're cleaning house, he said quietly. Walsh knew too much, and now that you've stirred things up, she became a liability. Are you in danger? Thornfield shrugged. I've been in danger for 30 years, but now, maybe, there's finally a chance to do something about it. Sarah stood up, clutching the envelope of documents. Dr. Thornfield, I need you to come with me. You're the only living witness who can testify about what happened at St. Catherine's. No, he said firmly. If I come with you now, I'll be dead within 24 hours. But Deputy Manning, find those children. Find the ones who survived. Give them back their real names. As Sarah headed for the door, Thornfield called after her. Deputy? Be very careful who you trust. This operation had protection at the highest levels of state government. Some of those people are still in power. Sarah nodded and left, her mind reeling from everything she'd learned. As she drove back toward town, she couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret Walsh's death was just the beginning. Someone was eliminating witnesses, and Sarah was getting very close to becoming a witness herself. Margaret Walsh's house was a crime scene now, surrounded by yellow tape and patrol cars with flashing lights. Sarah arrived to find the coroner's van parked in the driveway and Miller coordinating with the state police detective who had been called in. What happened? Sarah asked, joining Miller on the front lawn. Neighbor called it in about an hour after you left, Miller said, his expression grim. Said they heard a gunshot but didn't think much of it until they saw Walsh's front door standing wide open. Suicide? That's what it's supposed to look like. Single gunshot to the head, weapon in her hand, note on the kitchen table. Miller's tone suggested he wasn't buying it. But there are problems with the scene. Detective James Burke from the state police approached them, notebook in hand. Sarah recognized him from a few joint investigations over the years. Solid cop, thorough, not easily fooled. "Deputy Manning," Burke said, "I understand you spoke with the victim this afternoon?" "Routine follow-up on some old records," Sarah said carefully. "Nothing that would suggest she was suicidal?" "What kind of old records?" Sarah looked at Miller, who gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. They hadn't briefed the state police on St. Catharines yet, and Miller clearly wanted to keep it that way for now. "Administrative paperwork from the orphanage where she used to work," Sarah said. "Budget reports, staffing records, boring stuff." Burke studied her face. "She seemed upset when you left?" "Irritated that I was bothering her with questions about something that happened 30 years ago. But not suicidal upset." "Come take a look at the scene," Burke said. "Tell me what doesn't feel right to you." They walked into Walsh's house, which had been transformed from the cozy grandmother's home Sarah had visited into something cold and clinical. Crime scene photographers were documenting every angle, and the forensics team was dusting for prints. Walsh's body was still in the living room chair where she'd been found, slumped sideways with a small revolver on the floor beside her. The gunshot wound to her right temple was clean and close range, consistent with suicide. But Sarah immediately saw what had bothered Miller and Burke. "She's left-handed," Sarah said. "How do you know that?" Burke asked. "When she poured tea this afternoon, she used her left hand, wrote with her left hand when she signed something, but the gun is by her right hand." "Could have been transferred during the fall," Burke suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. Sarah studied the scene more carefully. Something else was bothering her, something beyond the gun placement. "The tea set is gone," she said. "What?" "When I was here this afternoon, she had a full tea service on the coffee table, teapot, cups, sugar bowl, the works. It's not here now." Miller and Burke exchanged glances. "Why would someone clean up the tea service but leave a suicide scene untouched?" Miller asked. "Because they didn't want anyone to know Walsh had a visitor after Deputy Manning left," Burke said. "Someone came here, had tea with her, then killed her and staged it as suicide." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Someone who knew her well enough that she'd invite them in for tea. "The suicide note," Burke said, leading them to the kitchen table. "What do you think of this?" The note was handwritten on Walsh's personal stationery. "I can't live with what we did to those children. The guilt has eaten away at me for 30 years. I'm sorry for my part in the terrible things that happened at St. Catharines. May God forgive me." Sarah read it twice. "It's too convenient. 3 hours ago she was denying everything, getting angry when I pressed her about the missing babies. Now suddenly she's confessing in a suicide note? Plus," Miller added, "look at the handwriting. Compare it to this." He showed them a grocery list he'd found on Walsh's refrigerator. The handwriting was similar, but not identical. The suicide note's letters were more careful, more deliberate. "Someone copied her handwriting," Sarah said. "Someone who had access to samples of her writing." Burke nodded grimly. "So we're looking at homicide disguised as suicide. The question is, who wanted Margaret Walsh dead, and why now?" Sarah thought about her conversation with Walsh, about the phone call Walsh had made immediately after Sarah left. "She called someone after I left, someone she trusted, someone who knew about St. Catharines." "Any idea who?" Sarah pulled out the envelope Thornfield had given her, making a decision. "Detective Burke, I need to brief you on what we've really found. This isn't about old administrative records. This is about systematic child theft, murder, and medical experimentation going back 30 years. She spread Thornfield's documents across Walsh's kitchen table, explaining what they'd discovered in the hidden room at St. Catharines. Burke's expression grew darker with each revelation. "Jesus Christ," he whispered when Sarah finished. You're talking about a conspiracy involving state agencies, medical institutions, and who knows how many other people. And Margaret Walsh was a key witness, Miller added, someone who could have identified the people at the top of this operation. So they eliminated her, Burke said, but that means they know you're investigating, which puts you in danger too. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. The number was blocked, but the message made her blood run cold. Stop digging or you'll end up like Margaret. Some secrets are worth killing for. She showed the message to Miller and Burke. Well, Burke said, that answers the question of whether they know you're investigating. Sarah's mind was racing. We need to get to Dr. Thornfield. If they killed Walsh to silence her, he's next on their list. Already thought of that, Miller said. I sent a unit to the retirement home 20 minutes ago. Sarah's radio crackled. All units, we have a 1054 at Sunset Manor Retirement Community. Structure fire, multiple units responding. Sarah felt her stomach drop. That's where Thornfield lives? They raced across town with lights and sirens, but Sarah knew they were too late. By the time they arrived at Sunset Manor, the fire department was already battling a blaze that had consumed most of Thornfield's unit. The fire chief met them in the parking lot. Started in the kitchen, spread fast. Looks like a gas leak ignition, but we won't know for sure until the investigation. Was anyone inside? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. One victim. Elderly male, probably overcome by smoke before he could escape. Sarah closed her eyes. 2 witnesses dead in the span of 3 hours. The people behind St. Catherine's were moving fast to eliminate anyone who could expose them. Sarah, Miller said quietly, we need to get you somewhere safe. You're the only person left who knows what they found in that hidden room. No, Sarah said firmly. I'm not hiding, but we need to move fast. They're cleaning house, which means they're panicking. People make mistakes when they panic. She pulled out Thornfield's documents again, studying the organizational chart by the light of the fire truck's flashing beams. Burke, look at this. Thornfield documented the entire network, names, locations, financial records. Burke leaned in, studying the papers. Some of these facilities are still operating, and some of these names, I recognize them. State officials, hospital administrators, people with serious political connections. Which means we can't trust anyone in the official system, Sarah said. Not until we know how deep this goes. Miller's radio crackled with an incoming call. Sergeant Miller, this is dispatch. We've got reports of a break-in at the county sheriff's office. Someone broke into the evidence room. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. The files from St. Catherine's. Someone's trying to steal the evidence. Go, Burke said. I'll coordinate with the fire investigation here, see if we can find any evidence that Thornfield's death wasn't accidental. As they raced back toward town, Sarah's mind was reeling. In the span of a few hours, the conspiracy had gone from a 30-year-old cold case to an active cover-up involving murder and arson. But she had one advantage. Thornfield's documents were still in her possession. The killers thought they'd eliminated all the evidence, but they were wrong. Sarah just hoped she could stay alive long enough to use it. The sheriff's office looked like a war zone. The back door had been jimmied open, file cabinets were overturned, and papers were scattered across the floor like snow. But what made Sarah's heart sink was the evidence locker. The heavy steel door hung open, and the shelves where they'd stored the St. Catherine's files were completely empty. They took everything, Miller said, surveying the damage. Every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence we collected from that hidden room. Sarah knelt beside the overturned filing cabinet, picking up scattered papers. How did they know exactly where we stored the files? This wasn't random vandalism. They knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it. Inside job, Burke said grimly. Someone in the department told them where the evidence was kept. The thought made Sarah's stomach turn. She'd worked with these people for years, trusted them with her life. But someone had betrayed that trust to protect a conspiracy that had been stealing and murdering children for decades. "Whoever it was," Miller said, "they were in a hurry. Look at this." He pointed to a manila folder that had been dropped near the evidence locker. Inside was a single document, a transfer order dated February 18, 1982, moving patient M47 from St. Catherine's to something called Pine Valley Research Institute. Sarah stared at the paper, her hands shaking. Patient M47. That was one of the babies in the maternity files. Born February 15th, supposedly died 3 days later. Pine Valley Research Institute, Burke read over her shoulder. I don't recognize that name. Sarah pulled out Thornfield's documents, spreading them across Miller's desk. "Here," she said, pointing to the organizational chart. "Pine Valley. It's one of the facilities in the network, located about 2 hours north of here." "Is it still operating?" Miller asked. Sarah studied the papers more carefully. According to this, Pine Valley was shut down in 1995 after a state inspection found irregularities in patient care. But look at this notation Thornfield made. Patients transferred to secure facility. Operation relocated, not terminated. Burke leaned in closer. So they moved the operation somewhere else when Pine Valley got too much attention. "But patient M47, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A baby born in 1982 would be 30 years old now. If he survived the research programs, if he's still alive." Her radio crackled to life. "All units, we have a 1091 at the Manning residence. Suspicious person reported on the property." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. "That's my house. They're going after my family." "No," Miller said firmly. "You're not going there alone. It's obviously a trap." "My mother lives there," Sarah snapped. "I'm not leaving her to deal with this." Burke was already moving toward the door. "We'll take 2 cars. Miller, call for backup, but tell them to stage a few blocks away. If we go in with sirens and lights, whoever's there might panic and hurt Sarah's mother." The drive to Sarah's house took 12 minutes that felt like hours. Sarah lived in a small ranch house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees that now looked like perfect hiding spots for anyone wanting to stage an ambush. They parked 2 blocks away and approached on foot. Burke took the back of the house while Sarah and Miller approached from the front. The front door was standing open. Sarah drew her weapon and moved carefully up the front steps. "Mom?" she called out. "It's Sarah. Are you okay?" No answer. Inside, the house was a mirror of the sheriff's office. Furniture overturned, drawers pulled out, papers scattered everywhere. But this wasn't random vandalism either. This was a targeted search. "Sarah," Miller called from the kitchen. "In here." Sarah found Miller standing next to the kitchen table, where someone had left a manila envelope with her name written on it in block letters. Inside the envelope was a single photograph. It showed an elderly woman sitting in what appeared to be a hospital room. The woman was thin and frail, with gray hair and frightened eyes. She was holding a sign that read, "Stop the investigation or she dies." Sarah's knees nearly buckled. "That's my mother." Attached to the photo was a note. "Pine Valley Research Institute, Building C, Room 237. Come alone. Bring the Thornfield documents. You have 2 hours." Burke appeared from the back of the house. "No sign of forced entry back there, but I found tire tracks in the yard. Someone parked behind the trees and approached from the rear." "They took my mother," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "They're using her as leverage to get Thornfield's documents." Miller took the photo from her hands, studying it. "Sarah, we need to think about this carefully. They've killed 2 people today to cover this up. They're not going to let you or your mother walk away from this." "I know," Sarah said, "but I can't just leave her there." Burke was examining the note. "Pine Valley Research Institute. According to Thornfield's documents, that place was supposed to be shut down 17 years ago." "But it's not," Sarah said. "They relocated the operation, probably underground. And now they're using it to hold my mother hostage." She looked at both men, her mind racing. "I have to go, but I need backup, and I need a way to document whatever we find there. If this conspiracy has been operating for 30 years, there have to be other victims being held at that facility." "The stolen children," Miller said quietly. "If they're still alive, they might be there." Sarah nodded. "Patient M47, the baby born February 15th, 1982. If he's still alive, he's been imprisoned at these facilities for 30 years. He doesn't even know his real name or where he came from." Burke pulled out his phone. "I'm calling for federal backup. This has gone beyond local jurisdiction." "No," Sarah said firmly. "They said, come alone. If they see federal agents, they'll kill my mother and disappear. These people have been operating in the shadows for 3 decades. They know how to vanish." She took a deep breath, making a decision that could cost her everything. "I'm going to Pine Valley, but I'm not going in blind." She turned to Miller. "Give me 1 hour, then call Burke's contacts at the FBI. If I'm not back with my mother by then, you'll know they killed us both." "Sarah." "No arguments. These people have been stealing children and destroying families for 30 years. It ends today." As she headed for the door, Burke called after her. "What if it's not just your mother? What if they have other people there? Other victims who've been held for decades?" Sarah paused in the doorway, Thornfield's documents clutched in her hand. "Then I guess I'm about to find out what happened to all those children who disappeared from St. Catherine's." She walked out into the gray afternoon, knowing she might be walking into a trap that would kill her, but also knowing that somewhere in that facility, people who had been stolen as babies were waiting for someone to finally come looking for them. And maybe, just maybe, she was about to find her brother. Pine Valley Research Institute sat at the end of a winding dirt road, hidden behind a wall of evergreen trees that blocked it from view of the main highway. Sarah had expected something ominous, a fortress-like compound with guard towers and razor wire. Instead, she found what looked like an abandoned medical complex, all faded brick and broken windows, with weeds growing through cracks in the parking lot. But appearances were deceiving. As Sarah drove closer, she noticed the security cameras mounted on poles throughout the property and the fact that several of the broken windows had been covered with one-way glass. The building might look abandoned, but it was very much in use. She parked in the main lot and checked her watch. 1 hour and 43 minutes since she'd found the photo of her mother. 17 minutes left before Miller would call in federal backup. Sarah had made one modification to the plan. Hidden in her jacket was a small digital recorder she'd grabbed from her house, the same kind reporters used for interviews. If she was walking into a trap, she wanted to document whatever she found inside this place. The main entrance was locked, but as she approached, a door opened, and a man in a white lab coat stepped out. He was middle-aged, balding, with the kind of soft features that would make him forgettable in a crowd. "Deputy Manning," he said in a tone that was almost friendly. "I'm Dr. Phillips. We've been expecting you. Where's my mother?" "Safe for the moment. Do you have the documents?" Sarah patted the envelope under her jacket. "I want to see her first." Dr. Phillips nodded as if this was reasonable. "Of course. Please, come in." The interior of the building was nothing like the exterior suggested. The hallways were clean and well lit, with the antiseptic smell of a functioning medical facility. Sarah's boots echoed on polished linoleum as Dr. Phillips led her deeper into the complex. "You know," Phillips said conversationally as they walked, "your investigation has caused quite a stir. 30 years of careful work, and you managed to unravel it in a matter of days." "Careful work," Sarah repeated. "Is that what you call stealing babies and murdering children?" Phillips paused at a security door and swiped a keycard. "We prefer to think of it as advancing human understanding. The research conducted here has contributed to breakthroughs in psychology, neurology, and behavioral science that have benefited countless people. Research conducted on stolen children. Children who would have grown up in poverty in broken homes with no opportunities," Phillips said as they entered an elevator. Here, they've contributed to something larger than themselves. The elevator descended for what felt like a long time. They were going deep underground. When the doors finally opened, Sarah found herself in a corridor that looked like a cross between a hospital and a prison. Doors lined both sides of the hallway, each marked only with a number. "Building C," Phillips said. "This is where we house our long-term subjects." Sarah's blood ran cold. Subjects? The children from St. Catherine's, of course, the ones who have been with us for 20, 30 years. They've provided invaluable data on the effects of controlled environments on human development. They stopped at room 237. Through a small window in the door, Sarah could see her mother sitting on a hospital bed, looking frightened but unharmed. "Now," Phillips said, "the documents." Sarah hesitated. Once she handed over Thornfield's papers, she'd have no leverage left. But looking at her mother through that window, she didn't have a choice. She pulled out the envelope and handed it to Phillips, who smiled and tucked it under his arm. "Excellent. Now there's something else I think you should see before we conclude our business." He led her further down the corridor, stopping at room 241. "This subject has been with us since 1982. Born at St. Catherine's, officially deceased at 3 days old, but actually one of our most successful long-term studies." Phillips swiped his keycard and opened the door. Inside was a small, sterile room with a hospital bed, a simple desk, and a man sitting in a chair by the window. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that looked familiar in a way that made Sarah's chest tighten. "Subject M47, Phillips said. "Or as he's known here, Michael." "Michael, we have a visitor." The man looked up at Sarah with curiosity, but no recognition. When he spoke, his voice was soft and hesitant, like someone who wasn't used to conversation. "Hello," he said. "Are you a new doctor?" Sarah felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. This was patient M47. The baby born February 15th, 1982. The baby whose mother was told he had died. The baby who, according to Sarah's calculations, had been born the same night her mother went into premature labor at St. Catherine's. "Michael," Sarah said carefully, "do you know what your last name is?" Michael looked confused. "I don't have a last name, just Michael." "Do you know where you came from? Before here?" "I've always been here," Michael said matter-of-factly. "The doctors take care of me. Sometimes they ask me questions or give me tests, but I've always been here." Sarah looked at Phillips, who was watching the interaction with scientific interest. 30 years, she whispered. "You've kept him locked up for 30 years. "He's been well cared for," Phillips said. "Fed, housed, given basic education. He's contributed to dozens of research studies on institutionalization, social development, and psychological adaptation. He's been imprisoned his entire life. He's been protected from a world he was never equipped to handle," Phillips corrected. "Michael has no concept of life outside this facility, no social skills, no practical knowledge. Releasing him would be cruel." Sarah turned back to Michael, who was watching their conversation with the detached interest of someone observing something that didn't concern him. "Michael," she said gently, "would you like to see what's outside this room? Outside this building?" Michael's eyes widened slightly. "Outside? There's nothing outside. The doctors told me. There's a whole world outside, trees and sky and other people, people who live in houses and have families." For the first time, something flickered in Michael's eyes. Curiosity, maybe, or hope. Phillips stepped forward. "That's enough, Deputy Manning. Michael, please return to your room activities." But Michael didn't move. He was staring at Sarah with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You look familiar," he said slowly. "Like someone I dreamed about once." Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes. "Michael, what if I told you that you have a mother, a real mother who's been looking for you your whole life?" Subject M47 has no family, Phillips said sharply. His mother died shortly after giving birth. He was an unwanted child who— His mother is alive, Sarah interrupted, and she never stopped believing he was alive, too. Michael stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Are you my mother? Sarah's heart broke. No, Michael, but I think I might be your sister. The words hung in the air like a physical thing. Phillips's face went white, and Sarah realized she'd just revealed something he hadn't known. Impossible, Phillips breathed. The records clearly show. The records were falsified, Sarah said. Michael, our mother went into labor at St. Catherine's on February 15th, 1982. She was told her baby died. But he didn't die. You didn't die. Michael was staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. Then, quietly, he said, I always wondered why I remembered singing. A woman singing to me. The doctors said it was impossible, but I remembered. Sarah's voice broke. Our mother used to sing lullabies. That's when Phillips made his move, reaching for what looked like a call button on the wall. But Michael was faster than anyone expected. 30 years of institutional living had given him quick reflexes. He grabbed Phillips's wrist, stopping him from reaching the alarm. No more tests, Michael said, his voice stronger than Sarah had heard it. No more questions. I want to see outside. And in that moment, Sarah knew they had a chance, not just to escape, but to save all the other subjects who were imprisoned in this underground facility. Michael, she said, are there others like you here? Other people who've been here for a long time. He nodded. Many others. Some have been here longer than me. Some came when they were very small. Sarah's recorder was still running in her jacket pocket, capturing everything. How many? 26 in this building, Michael said without hesitation. I count them during exercise time. 26 people. 26 stolen children who had been turned into research subjects, locked away from the world for decades. Sarah looked at Phillips, who was backed against the wall now, his face pale with fear. You're going to help us get them out, she told him. All of them. Or I'm going to make sure the whole world knows what you've been doing here. But as she spoke, she heard the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside. Heavy boots, moving fast. Security was coming, and Sarah realized that getting into Pine Valley had been the easy part. Getting out alive was going to be much harder. The footsteps in the corridor were getting closer, but Michael moved with surprising purpose. He pressed his ear to the door, listened for a moment, then turned to Sarah. 6 guards, he whispered. They always send 6 when there's a problem, but I know another way. Phillips started to protest, but Michael grabbed him by the lab coat and shoved him into the corner. You stay quiet, or I tell them about the restricted files you keep in your office. Sarah stared at her brother, because she was certain now that's who he was, with new respect. 30 years of captivity hadn't broken him. It had taught him to observe, to listen, to survive. What restricted files? She asked Phillips. Michael answered before Phillips could speak. Files about the ones who died, the subjects who didn't survive the experiments. He keeps photos. Phillips's face went gray. Michael, you don't understand what you're saying. I understand perfectly, Michael said, his voice cold. I've been watching and listening for 30 years. I know about the failures. I know about the graves behind Building A. I know about the new children who arrive and disappear after a few months. Sarah felt sick. The scope of this operation was even worse than she'd imagined. How many children have died here? 43 that I know of, Michael said matter-of-factly. Some from the experiments, some from what they call disposal when subjects become non-compliant. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Sarah heard the beep of a keycard being swiped. Move, Michael said, leading them to what looked like a solid wall. But when he pressed a specific panel, a section swung inward, revealing a narrow maintenance corridor. Service tunnels. I've been mapping them for years." They squeezed through the opening just as the door to Michael's room burst open. Sarah could hear guards shouting, searching the room, demanding to know where the subjects had gone. The maintenance tunnel was cramped and dark, lit only by small emergency lights every few feet. Michael moved through it like he'd done this hundreds of times before. "Where does this lead?" Sarah whispered. "Building C, basement level. There's an exit to the parking garage. But first—" Michael stopped at what looked like a junction in the tunnel system. "First, we get the others." "Michael, we can't save everyone right now. We need to get out and bring help back." "No," his voice was firm. "If we leave them, they'll be moved or killed before help arrives. I've seen it happen before. When inspectors came in 1995, 12 subjects disappeared overnight." Sarah realized he was right. The moment this facility was compromised, the evidence would be destroyed, including the human evidence. "How do we get to them?" Michael pointed down a different corridor. "Most of them are in the communal area now. It's dinner time. If we can reach them without triggering the main alarms—" They moved through the tunnel system, Phillips stumbling behind them. Sarah kept her recorder running, documenting everything Michael told her about the facility's layout, the daily routines, the experiments that had been conducted on him and the others. "They studied isolation effects," Michael explained as they crawled through a particularly narrow section. "Some subjects were kept in solitary confinement for months at a time. They studied the effects of sensory deprivation, sleep interruption, nutritional deficiencies." "And drug testing," Phillips added reluctantly. "Psychiatric medications, experimental compounds." Sarah turned to stare at him. "You're volunteering information now?" "Because when this gets out, and it will get out now, I want it on record that I tried to stop some of the more extreme experiments. I documented my objections." "You documented your objections while children were being tortured and murdered?" Sarah's voice was deadly quiet. Phillips fell silent. They emerged from the tunnel system into what appeared to be a kitchen storage area. Through a set of double doors, Sarah could hear voices, multiple people talking quietly. Michael peered through the door's window. 23 of them are in there. The other 3 are in the medical wing." "What's in the medical wing?" Michael's expression darkened. "Subjects who are being prepared for disposal. They're very sick." Sarah felt rage building in her chest. These weren't subjects or patients or research participants. These were people, children who had grown into adults while imprisoned, who had never experienced freedom, who didn't even know their real names. "Michael, when we go in there, what do I need to know about the others? Will they trust you?" "Some will. Others have been here longer. They're afraid of change, afraid of punishment. But if I tell them it's safe—" Sarah's radio crackled to life. Miller's voice came through in a harsh whisper. "Sarah, if you can hear this, we've got federal agents surrounding the building, but they're being told to wait. Someone with authority is blocking the raid." Phillips smiled grimly. "I told you this operation had protection at high levels." Sarah keyed her radio quietly. "Miller, I'm inside with approximately 26 victims, long-term prisoners. I need you to document everything I'm about to transmit." She pulled out her phone and started taking photos of the facility layout, of Phillips, of the tunnel system. Then she opened the doors to the communal area. What she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life. 23 adults, ranging in age from their 20s to their 40s, sat at metal tables eating from plastic trays. All wore identical gray uniforms. Most had the pale, hollow look of people who had never seen sunlight. A few rocked back and forth or made repetitive motions with their hands. When Sarah and Michael entered, the room fell completely silent. "It's okay," Michael said softly. "This is Sarah. She's here to help us." A woman who appeared to be in her 30s looked up with eyes that were both intelligent and utterly broken. "Help us what?" "Help us leave," Michael said. "Help us go outside." The reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. Some of the people began crying. Others cowered as if they expected to be punished. A few stood up, moving toward Michael with desperate hope in their faces. "Outside isn't real," said a man who looked to be about Sarah's age. "The doctors showed us pictures. It's too dangerous." "The outside is real," Sarah said gently, "and it's not dangerous. There are people out there who have been looking for you, people who never stopped believing you were alive." She pulled out her phone and showed them the photo she'd taken of the sky and trees in the parking lot. "This is what's above us right now. Sun, trees, fresh air." More tears, more confusion, but also something else, curiosity. "My name is Subject F-23, said the woman who had spoken first. "I was born here." Sarah's heart broke again. "What if I told you that you weren't born here? What if you had a real name and a real family?" Phillips spoke up from behind them. "Don't give them false hope. Most of them have been here so long that even if they had families, those people are dead now." Michael turned on him with fury. "Like my mother was dead? Like Sarah's mother was dead?" That's when Sarah heard it, the sound of helicopters overhead and sirens approaching from multiple directions. Her radio crackled. "Sarah, the feds are moving in." Someone overruled the order to wait. "You've got maybe 2 minutes before this place is swarmed." Sarah looked around the room at 23 people who had lived their entire lives in captivity, who didn't know their own names, who had been systematically abused and experimented on for decades. "Listen to me," she said, raising her voice so everyone could hear. "In about 1 minute, this building is going to be full of police officers and federal agents. They're here to help you, not hurt you. Some of you are going to be scared, and that's okay. But I need you to remember that you have names, real names, and families who never stopped looking for you." She turned to Michael. "Are you ready to meet our mother?" Michael nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I've been ready for 30 years. The sound of boots thundering down the corridors was getting louder. Doors were being kicked open throughout the facility. "Federal agents, building is secure." Sarah held up her badge as armed agents poured into the communal area. "Deputy Sheriff Manning, these are victims, not suspects." What followed was chaos. 23 people who had never seen law enforcement officers reacting with terror, agents trying to secure the facility while treating traumatized victims, paramedics being called to assess people who had been subjected to decades of medical experimentation. But in the middle of it all, Sarah found herself sitting beside Michael as he held her hand and asked the question she'd been waiting 30 years to answer. "What's our mother's name?" "Linda," Sarah said. "Her name is Linda Manning, and she's been waiting to sing you lullabies again." 6 months later, Sarah stood in the courthouse as the final verdicts were read. Dr. Phillips, life in prison without parole. 3 facility administrators, 25 to life. A state official who had protected the operation, 15 years. Margaret Walsh and Dr. Thornfield were posthumously named as key conspirators, but their deaths had been ruled homicides, killed by other members of the conspiracy to prevent them from testifying. Of the 26 people rescued from Pine Valley, 18 had been successfully reunited with family members who had never stopped looking for them. The other 8 were working with therapists and social workers to build new lives, free for the first time in decades. And Michael, whose real name was David Michael Manning, lived with Sarah and their mother now, slowly learning what it meant to be part of a family. He still had nightmares, still flinched when doctors entered the room, still sometimes woke up confused about where he was. But he also laughed now, sang along with the radio, spent hours in the garden, marveling at how things grew from the ground. And every morning he asked Sarah the same question. "What are we going to do today?" For 30 years, that question had been answered for him by people who saw him as a research subject. Now, finally, he got to answer it himself. The conspiracy that had operated for decades was broken. The children who had been stolen were coming home. And Sarah Manning had learned that sometimes the most important investigations weren't about solving crimes. They were about bringing families back together.